Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks for coming to this afternoon's meeting. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute, and we're very happy to be the godfather of this occasion. I say the godfather because it has been put together and organized by Arpád Csabuda, who is here on my right, and he joined us as an intern not long ago, but we already knew him because he had invited me to take part in a very impressive symposium on the European Union and Brexit at an earlier stage. He has since done several things with us and for us, and we've always found what he's done very exciting and challenging and interesting. We also, of course, are in principle committed to encouraging young people to take an interest in international affairs, politics, cultural life, and in all of the riches of a free society. So we were very happy to be associated with this event. Associated is the correct word, however, at this point, my association of it comes to an end, and I hand over to Arpád Csabuda, who has put it together, and ask him to introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for your remarks. I'm also very happy that you provided us the chance to organize the event, and I'm even more pleased that we gathered such big numbers. Obviously today's event is going to focus on the elections, which were held more than a month ago. The moods calmed down in the meanwhile, so most of the municipalities managed to start their work, which gives us, I think, the perfect time to analyze the event from a month perspective. Let me introduce the panelists first. On my right is Orbán Balázs, Parliamentary and Strategic Secretary of State from the Prime Minister's Office. Then we have Boris, who is the Correspondent of the Welt, and on the right side of the table we have Pogatsa Zoltán, who is the editor-in-chief of the Egyenlőség. At the end of the event, we will hear a correspondent of the discussion will be Mark Higgy, who is the senior fellow of the Danube Institute. That's pretty much it. So just to sum up quickly what happened at the election, I don't mean to go so much into details, but there was a growing debate in the parliament and in the media about that who win actually the elections. Whether Fidesz lost it or not, that was the main question. Just to say the quick figures, the opposition won 14 districts out of the 23 in Budapest, as well as won the major contest in the capital, while Fidesz won all the counties of the country and won 13 cities with county rights out of the 23. So my first question for the panelists would be to share briefly their feelings and their opinion on the election result itself, and then we will go on to more precise questions. And I think we should start with Balázs, if it's fine with you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a privilege to be here, so thank the opportunity for you and for the godfather of this event, John, as well. From this perspective, from the facts perspective, I think your question is quite simple because it's not questionable that Fidesz won the local elections as the ruling party, or the ruling parties won the previous European parliamentary elections and the national elections as well back in 2018. It is very visible that the support of Fidesz is still quite huge. They got almost 2 million votes, which is more than 50% of the votes, and the opposite parties, all the parties and all the independent candidates, so everything which was against, from a party political perspective, to what Fidesz and KDNP got was around 1.6 million. Obviously, what was the result is quite similar to the local elections result what we had in 2006. Most probably some of you were not in the country back at that time, but in 2006, the MSP and the SDS, so the formal post-communist, socialist and neoliberal parties, they won the national elections, But after the so-called speech of Öszöd came out, where the former Prime Minister Ferenc Gyurcsány was talking about that they lied during the campaign, lied to the voters, so it obviously caused a serious political turbulence in Hungary. And after a couple months, the post-communists and the liberals, they lost the local elections. So it's quite funny that the results in 2006 were very similar to the results what we had 1 month ago. But the interpretation of the same result was completely different, because back at that time everybody was talking about that Fidesz had a landslide victory, and voters sent a message to the ruling post-communist liberal parties that they are fed up with what's going on. And with the same quite good results, currently everybody is talking about whether the Fidesz won the elections or not. So that's how politics works. According to my analysis, Fidesz won the elections. It was a midterm election. So for every governing party, having a midterm election is always a very critical thing. From this perspective, the result again is not very bad. Obviously, lost Fidesz and the ruling parties, they lost some of the big and important cities, which is never a nice thing. But I think their chance, or our chance, to win in 2022 again, it's quite good, but we have to working on that. Politics is back in Hungary.
Right. Well, if we look at the elections just at a point in time, and just at the percentages, then I would completely agree with Balázs. And obviously, there was no big change in voter support for any political camp. But what did change, obviously, is that the opposition parties ganged up on Fidesz and were able to win some cities, mainly the main trophy, of course, being Budapest. And that means they now have a somewhat larger power base, simply. And that does qualify as a win for them in that respect, I would say so. Maybe we should talk a little bit about what happened just after the elections. And I'm curious to know your opinion, Balázs, about the dynamic that is now developing as a result of the election. We had a repeat of elections in some communities, I think in 10 communities, and that and these renewed elections showed a dynamic that seemed to benefit the opposition just 2 weeks after the event, after the main local elections. Then another question, and of course it took only 5 weeks, I think, for the opposition parties in Budapest after the triumph to create, I think, 5 scandals in 5 Budapest districts. So we may see them encountering a number of difficulties as time goes on, and they all stab each other in the back. But obviously, when thinking ahead and trying to imagine what may happen in the next parliamentary elections in 2022, these are things that you need to keep in mind. A new power base for the opposition, a new highly visible candidate, potential candidate in the person of Gergely Karácsony, who is not getting any headwind from any media. Everyone seems to like him a lot, except of course in conservative circles. And and then I have a question about opinion polls. They didn't seem to get it right at Nézőpont and Századvég, the government-affiliated polling institutions, and they didn't get it right in the parliamentary elections either, did they? And I think it was you who said we were caught in a media bubble, exaggerating. Oh no, what's the contrary of exaggerating? Diminishing, or trying to play down what you saw in your own numbers. And now what happened? the prognosis was from these institutions a huge win for István Toldos, and that did not happen at all, did it? And there was a new poll by, I think it was by Nézőpont maybe 2 weeks ago, where I stopped to think what that might mean when the number of non-committed voters, those who did not yet know what they would vote for if the next election was now, was at 26%. And I wonder if that is not an unusually low number for Hungary, but you know better. If it is an unusually low number, that would mean that we have a very high voter mobilization at this point, and there's no election awaiting us. So what does that mean? I think the dynamics have led to a new situation where the government has changed its tone. It has become more friendly towards the opposition. There's less of a harsh, less of a rash tone on the government side, and less inflammatory tone on the opposition side as well. People seem to have figured out that it's better to try and get along with each other for the time being.
I basically agree with both of you, everything you've said. I'd spend a little bit more time analyzing the opposition, what happened in the opposition, because pretty much I agree that what happened on the Fidesz side is what Balázs described. I think in the opposition there was a change of generations in a sense. The larger cities in Hungary are, to a large degree, left-wing and liberal. Budapest has always had a slight left-wing liberal majority, as have most of the larger cities. So the question is not so much why they won this time around, the question is why they failed to win in previous rounds. When Fidesz actually managed to win both Budapest and the major countryside towns and cities. And I think the answer is that in previous times they ran candidates who were generally disliked by the population, people who had associated themselves with the worst times of neoliberal, left liberal governance in Hungary, i.e. the period between 2004 and 2009. For those of you who are not in Hungary at the time, that's a time when Hungary runs a gigantic budget deficits, debt to GDP increases. Hungary is forced to take a loan from the IMF to the extent of 20% of GDP. They're on the brink of a collapsing economy, and the Prime Minister, there's the lie speech that Balázs mentioned, so politically they're very weak and unpopular, and the Prime Minister is forced to resign and hand over. So a lot of people who were associated with that darkest period of left liberal governance still ran as candidates in 2000, I'm too lazy to count back, 5 years ago and 10 years ago. So basically, I mean, I just mentioned one symbolic person who I think encapsulates what I'm talking about. The last time the candidate for Budapest mayor was Lajos Bokros, who is well hated all over Hungary for having introduced the famous Bokros package, a neoliberal package of austerity. He's associated with, he's probably the prime face of neoliberalism in Hungary, the most recognized face of neoliberalism in Hungary. He was the candidate of the opposition. Certain opposition parties, of course, could not support such a figure. So, for instance, Jobbik, the then far-right party, since then not so far-right, and the Greens, for instance, were obviously unable to support such a figure. This time around, they had a better generation of politicians, cleaner, fresher, with more so pro-social ideas. So the contrast between Karácsony Gergely and Lajos Bokros couldn't be greater. Much better candidate, much more liked, with much fresher ideas, somebody who had not associated himself with those previous times. So therefore you had the support the tacit support of Jobbik, and you had the explicit support of the Greens and basically every other party as well. So not surprisingly, if you have better candidates, but I can mention a long list of candidates in Budapest and across the country as well. People like András Piko or Tamás Soproni or Márta Nassai or a lot of other candidates are actually clean, fresh faces, not associated with corruption, not associated with previous politics in Hungary. They're seen as clean, pro-social faces, which is in contrast both to the previous social liberal era, but also to some of the Fidesz politicians who have associated themselves with corruption and with privileging certain richer people within their districts with flats and free parking spaces and stuff like that. So they were a fresh contrast, and therefore they won in areas where naturally that's pretty much the case in effectively, I would think, almost every country in the world, that the capital cities and the larger urban centers tend to be more left liberal, and the countryside tends to be more conservative. There's no wonder there. The question is, to me, why they had not won previous rounds. Why they won this time is simply because they had better candidates and a more unified opposition.
We touched already some of the points that I wanted to ask. For instance, the failed figures of the past from the liberal parties, which I will refer later on. But I would like to also refer to your remarks, Balázs, that you said that the results were very similar to you draw a parallel between 2006 and this municipality election, drawing that it was a similar phenomena. So do you and all the other panelists think that could this be a turnover point? Could this be could the result indicate the end of this era and portend the beginning of a new era?
But please don't misinterpret what I was saying, because I was just referring on the fact that with the same results what we had this year and what we had in 2006, it can, with the exact same figures, it can have a very different political interpretation. So I'm not saying that that the same thing will happen with the governing parties. I'm saying right the opposite, that we are not in the same situation at all. It's just that what I was referring to, that the midterm elections, when you had a nice but not a very robust victory, it means different. Sometimes the same results have a different meanings. But I just wanted to add one more comment that I think it's very important in every international environment that we have to underline the fact that although I don't like the results, because the ruling parties, they lost Budapest and some other big cities, but I'm happy from one perspective that finally we can say that all the accusations that we're going against Hungary, that we don't have democracy here, it turned out that these accusations are nonsense. So it's nonsense. It's a working, operating democracy. All the parties can win. The governing parties and the opposition can win strong positions. So everybody from the 13th of October who is talking about an autocratic system, or talking about the end of democracy, or talking about anything which is connected to this issue, I think it's irrational, and it's not more than a political opinion. So it's not a neutral analysis anymore. That's why at least I am happy with the results.
It's never been a neutral analysis.
Oh well, okay, but still, what happened? I think the public opinion polls were not bad. So the general attitude, even in also in the countryside, but even in Budapest, it's quite positive. We have 5% GDP growth. So if you have 5% GDP growth, it means then that grassroots voters, they are more positive than if you have minus 5% GDP growth. So it's against mathematics and psychology, so it's nothing special. So the general public atmosphere is not bad. Grassroots Hungarian voters, they are quite positive. But in the last weeks, the campaign was not about what the governing parties and what the mayors did with the towns, with the small villages, or with the country. It was about one scandal, which was a sexual scandal, and the accusations were saying that it's somehow linked with corruption. And it didn't turn out that it has anything to do with the corruption issue. It was a clear-cut sexual scandal. What we had on the left side as well, so the mayor of Budaörs and those local politicians from the left side in the 15th district, they were also filmed with some not only sexual but corruption cases. But I think there is a double standard in that field, and I'm fine with the double standard. So I'm a right-wing conservative politicians, and I'm saying that what is allowed to do for a left-wing liberal politicians, it's not allowed to do for a conservative right-wing politician. So I accept the double standard. I'm just saying that there is a double standard. So what is acceptable for a leftist liberal politician to do in connection with corruption issues or sexual scandals is not allowed to do on the right side. That's why the right side is a better side than the left side, according to my obviously not objective analysis. So I'm happy to realize that Zsolt Borkai, who was the mayor of Győr and who was the main figure in this scandal, is not anymore a party member, not anymore the mayor of Győr. So he had to resign. But nothing happened on the other side. So they are still in power, they are still elected politicians, they are still operating, and no one is taking care. So that's the double standard I was talking about. But these scandals were coming up in the last couple weeks. They totally changed the tone of the campaign. The campaign was not anymore about whether the mayors or the city leaders are doing their job properly or not, but it was about whether you accept this scandal or not. Obviously, no one is on the acceptance side. So from this perspective, the result is not a surprise. It's changed the political landscape temporarily in the big cities, but according to our polls, it was a temporary change. So still, the support of the ruling parties after the election, it did not drop. It just remained on the same quite high level, which would mean almost a two-thirds majority in the elections, in the national elections in 2022. And I really like the comment of Zoltán about the globalist, localist tension point between the voters. So just imagine the situation that you have a Tory mayor in London, or a Le Pen party mayor in Paris, or a PiS mayor in Warsaw, or how scandalous it would be a CSU or CDU mayor in Berlin. So it's impossible, because all these big cities, all these capitals are led by left-wing, sometimes radical left-wing globalist politicians, because these cities are the headquarters of globalist policies and politics as well. Fidesz and KDNP, so the governing parties, but are obviously on the other side. So they are having a clear-cut localist position. They believe in nation states. They believe in the importance of families, the importance of marriage, the importance of borders, the importance of cultural differences, the importance of social cohesion. They go against the liberal economic elite. They go against the activity of George Soros. So from a globalist perspective, these statements are not acceptable. So it's not a big surprise that Fidesz only has a relative majority in Budapest, but not an absolute majority. But in the country, if you count all the parts of the country together, put all the numbers together, then it turns out that Fidesz and KDNP still, they have the absolute majority.
Well, I more or less agree with everything Balázs has said. I'd just like to offer some thoughts to ponder as we go on into the future. Momentum is now the leading opposition force. If I read the last Nézőpont poll correctly, with 13% ahead of the others. Would you not say so?
No, the numbers are not important because the opposition is. It's really from the opposition side because those voters who are not voting for Orbán, they are anti-Orbán voters, and they shift their support from one party to another. So it does not matter temporarily which party is the strongest and which party used to be the strongest. They are flat voters, if I may call it like this. I don't know, John, from an English-speaking perspective, it would make sense, but something like this.
I slightly disagree with that. I think you're right for MSP and DK. Doesn't matter. They went from one party to the other. I do think that Momentum has a slightly different identity.
Yeah, but how would you describe the situation that those who voted for Momentum, they accepted Ferenc Gyurcsány, the former prime minister? Those who voted for Jobbik, and you're saying that they are clear-cut Jobbik voters, which has a radical right-wing extremist identity, they supported Ferenc Gyurcsány. So it's from a rational perspective, you cannot explain why a Jobbik voter would support Ferenc Gyurcsány, because the whole story of Jobbik is that they want to go against Gyurcsány and against the post-communists and against the neoliberals. So that's why I'm saying that in this situation, sometimes these decisions are not rational, but more irrational ones.
Well, I think this was less ideological and more tactical voting. That doesn't mean they like Gyurcsány. All I wanted to point out is that it's clear that Momentum is growing. It has been growing ever since their campaign to stop the Olympic Games in Budapest. And why am I pointing that out? It is because Fidesz has found a devastating response to every other opposition party. It has found something to say about all the other parties with one word, which is simply devastating. Jobbik is fascist and racist. MSP is ex-communist, DK is corrupt gangsters. They can say this about all these parties. I don't think they have found a crisp, effective, negative message on Momentum. What is it? Tell me.
Momentum is the new SDS, which is true. Which is true.
Yes,
that's the party of the neoliberal elite.
Yes, but
that's the
voters.
New party.
Yes, but voters who vote for Momentum don't even remember who SDS is.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's a bit long on the tooth. SDS. When were they around? You know. So same for Korachan as a candidate. I think it's very difficult at the moment to find something really bad to say about him. You mentioned fresh faces and new elements in the political landscape. So I think the emergence of momentum is one of those. It's interesting that you mentioned Sopron. I happened to watch a few of his events and see his sloganeering in the campaign. And it's really funny because they had these posters with many things in small letters, but in big letters you could see only trees and order. And this kind of conservative green combination I can very well see in Germany. Markus Söder, CSU party chief and prime minister of Bavaria, shouting that out on the political Aschermittwoch, trees, order. So I think they may be onto some effective sloganeering there on the momentum side. And I wonder whether Fidesz is casting an eye on these new developments, these new faces, what to do with them, how to respond to them. And I think it will be interesting to see how they are able to react to that. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, I'd like to respond to a couple of points made here. One of them is this issue of whether there is democracy in Hungary or not. I think there are two extreme positions in the debate in Hungary about whether there is democracy or not. One extreme position basically says there's no democracy in Hungary. And the only way to topple Viktor Orbán is through some kind of non-parliamentary means. Now, I've never understood that. Like, you know, if you say that, what do you exactly want to do? Do you want to start a revolution? Do you want to force the elected government out of power? Who's going to follow you? You walk into the street and you have, you know, each party in the opposition has about 5-6% of the populace behind them. How large is your revolution going to be? So I never understood that position. The other extreme position is the one presented by Balázs here, who says, well, we have perfect democracy, there's nothing to see. We've just proved that Hungary is a functioning democracy. Well, not quite. I mean, yes, the elections prove that you can, if you are extremely clever, unite all your forces, all the opposition parties, work together, you can achieve change in this system. So therefore, it's obviously not true to say that we don't have any form of a democracy. But it's a very, very, very uneven playing field. And if you look at the resources that are available to the government parties for campaigns, for populist spending out of the budget, out of the state coffers, just the amount of money available for campaigning. If you look at the control of the state media, I could go on and on and on and on. There's a lot of, I mean, this is well known from Hungarian discussions. It's a very, very uneven playing field. So yes, it's not, democracy is not absent, but it's not a well-functioning democracy. It's a very tilted and managed democracy. A lot of aspects of it being managed from behind. The other thing that I wanted to react to is this issue of Győr. Now, Balázs, you say that it's simply a sexual scandal and that's all there is to see. Well, there's a lot more than just simply the sexual scandal. Obviously, that is the aspect of it which raised interest. But there's a lot of unexplained things about the wealth of this mayor that we're talking about. Where does his wealth come from? Where does the offshore companies registered in Luxembourg come from? The wealth of his son? A lot of these. Now, if Hungary was a really well-functioning democracy, you would have the Attorney General and you would have the Court of Auditors investigating this case. This is a huge challenge to local democracy in Győr, and I think in a well-functioning democracy you would have an independent investigation. Both the Attorney General and the Court of Auditors have refused to investigate the case, and there still remain enormous question marks about the wealth, the accumulated wealth of this mayor. That is no longer the mayor, of course, but the question is still there. What I also disagree with is this division of Hungarian politicians into globalists and localists. I think it would be a very convenient framework for Fidesz if this was the case, but unfortunately I don't think this is the case. You take Karácsony Gergely, now I would hardly call him a globalist. I mean, Karácsony Gergely comes from a Green Party, he comes from a very globalization critical background. I think it's very, very far away from an accurate description of Karácsony's politics to call him a globalist. He would roll back way too many aspects of globalization. In any Western political scene, he would be considered a green left politician, very globalization critical. No way would I put him in a globalist camp. Where on the other hand, is Viktor Orbán an anti-globalist? Is he a localist? I mean, shortage of time, but I'll just give you one single aspect. This government has given more state support to transnational companies active in Hungary than any previous government before. Is that localist, is that nationalist, or is that globalist? To me, that's a globalist position. More direct state support than any previous government in Hungary before. We are living in a country which is part and parcel of the German economic machine, and more so now than ever before in the last 30, 35 years since transition. I think this division into globalists and localists is very, very doubtful.
I'd just like to say one brief thing. I don't think there has been an even playing field in any election ever since the beginning of times. And you can't have a perfect playing field ever. If you look at Germany, do you think there's an even playing field for AfD? Do you think they get much time on public TV, for instance? Do you think they get a lot of time on mainstream media?
I agree, Boris, but I invite you to a football game where the playing field is not tilted this much, but tilted this much. Okay, I live up on the 12th district. There's plenty of spaces there where we can play football, where I'm up on top of the hill and you're down in the valley.
Thank you for your remarks. I found it interesting. There is a growing topic whether we live in a democracy or not in Hungary. I must share the views both of Orbán and Zoltán on the question. I think we are in between, but more on the democratic side. However, I find it a little sarcastic that after the election in the last weeks, the government was trying to prove that we live in an election, we live in a democracy since we lost the election. And when it comes that, for me, it's already too bad. It should be natural and obvious that we live in a democracy, and it should be above question. So for me at least, once the government and its representative tries to prove that we live in a democracy, for me, it's already bad. And when it comes to momentum, just a quick remark, I really hope that they managed to write themselves down in the eye of the Hungarian society last week when they supported a Romanian presidential candidate in the Romanian election. So I think that's pretty much sums up their view and their place in the Hungarian spectrum. Back to the election. The municipality election is considered to be the only one where we first look at the people, look at the person themselves, and we elect the persons, and then secondary is the political affiliation. This was certainly not the case this time in Buda, for instance, in Budapest, because Fidesz lost districts which was historically being Fidesz supported on the one hand, and which is more important, they lost mayors who were actually done a relatively effective job, which was both accepted by the opposition and the government itself. So what is the conclusion from this in the perspective of Fidesz? And what also, just to bring it further, how will this be analyzed in their policies? Will there change something? Will there change their view and approach to these questions?
Just one comment about Gergely Karácsony. Zoltán, you know very well that I accept the point of view that we can talk about his principle. But really, does it matter what his principles are? It does not matter at all, because he is on the top of a group of people, a group of politicians who are on the post-communist neoliberal side. You can see it very clearly. The whole crew came back, and they are working, they have their proper job at the Budapest municipal from the very first moment. So the day after he was with his principles of anti-globalist and anti-neoliberal and all the positive things you mentioned, the day after he was elected, he collected a group of alliances, a group of companions, a group of colleagues, which are full with post-communist and neoliberal ideas. So I most probably, personally, you know him better than I do, but in this case, it does not matter what he thinks about the world, because finally they won the elections, and finally I can say that it's not my opinion, it's the fact that look on the Budapest municipal, look who are the people who are working on there, who are the deputy mayors there. The deputy mayors, they are newcomer globalist extremist green politicians and post-communist neoliberal Hungarian communists. These are the two types of people. You cannot find anything else. All the deputy mayors are coming from these camps. Democracy. I don't like to talk about the issue of democracy, but it's not our interest to talk about that at all. So our problem is that we are accused on a daily basis about that. And let me give you just one example, the Article 7 procedure. What we're saying in connection with the Article 7 procedure is that during these political motivated procedures, you cannot decide whether a European country is a 100% democracy or only a 95% democracy. They are politically motivated procedures. And those who are not on the government side, in the European Parliament and in the European institutions, they're using this, they're using legal institutions and using their majority in the European Parliament and in the European institutions to put political pressure on the government. So, and the political pressure is on us. Our resources, all the resources of Foreign Affairs Ministry, all the resources of our politicians, we have to go to Brussels and talk about the democracy issue. I don't want to talk about the democracy issue because we think that we have democracy here, so we want to do our job. We want to govern the country and serve the people, but we have to go to Brussels on a daily basis and try to explain that we are a democracy just as any other countries where you have as serious problems as you were mentioning. In Germany, in Sweden, in the United Kingdom. But I don't want to raise the question. I simply don't want to talk about the level and the quality of German democracy, because it's not my job. So it's not my job. It's my job and the government's job to serve the people and to run the country. So it's not our decision that we, on a daily basis, keep talking about the abstract level of democracy here in Hungary. That's the political weapon which is used from a double standard perspective against us, and nothing more. And that's why I started this conversation with underlining that finally I have a fact. So I have a proof that I can say that, we lost Budapest. It's not good for us. So it's obviously we don't have any tools to stop it, and we don't want to stop it because we live in parliamentary system, we live in local autonomy, and we believe in democracy. That's all. You mentioned the civic, and you had the previous question about what will happen. I think, again, nothing new under the sun. Our interest is to have a fair partnership with the new leaders. It's a strong and really a prosperous capital, and without this without a strong capital, we cannot build a strong nation. So we need a strong capital to have a strong nation. So our goal is to cooperate with all the elected mayors and city leaders. We will see how they will react, because their decisions are not always rational, that they are not very well planned according to our view. And what we see, as I was mentioning, I don't want to raise this issue once again, but the old players and the old elite came back, and the 20 years of Demszky Gábor mayorship, it wasn't a huge success for Budapest. So between 1990s and between 2010, it wasn't the strongest period of time for Budapest. So my fear is that because all the people who were responsible for this failure in the old period of time, they came back. So we will have, with the same people, we will have the same result. And obviously, it's against the interests of the government. So we have to cooperate. We're looking for the opportunities of cooperation. We don't want to set up a scene when there is an ongoing Cold War between the mayor of Budapest and the government, but we want to protect the people and the interests of Budapest, even those voters who were voting against the government. And you mentioned the Buda district. I'm Zoltán mentioned that my opinion is an extremist opinion about democracy, so probably I'm a well-known extremist in the Hungarian government, but I'm a typical Budapest downtown and civic district guy. So I know these opinions and those people very well. They are very normal civic, normal voters with a very typical civic mindset, where if you see in the news that there are scandals like we had in the Borkai case, and we have some other issues, they will not get you the support. That's what happened. So
you think that it played a significant role?
Obviously, it played a significant role. You also mentioned that it was not about how the district mayors were operating, because what they did in the last 9 years or 30 years in the case of the first district, so the Buda Castle district, for example, the positive signs are everywhere, but they want to send a sign that they do not accept this kind of behavior, which is, from my perspective, again, it's totally fair and totally acceptable. Fidesz has to react and change the tone and not giving opportunity for these politicians. And then I think the support is, there is a possibility that the support will come back.
The interesting thing about the Borkai scandal is, of course, that he was a candidate at all. I cannot imagine that nobody in Fidesz knew anything about his lifestyle. And having, I'm sure you didn't, but I cannot imagine that there was no information in the party whatsoever. And having an electoral campaign based on the family theme, on being conservative, family-friendly, etc., and having him as a candidate, I wonder if that was not somewhat risky, if indeed people knew about this. I just want to say one thing about Pogatsa and the Demszky people coming back. Well, the devastating aspect of that is, of course, that he was asked, what about these guys? What are they doing here all of a sudden? And he said, well, it's not my decision. My partners made recommendations, and, well, I accepted them. So what he was, in effect, saying is that I cannot lead, because leadership begins with decisions about whom to have in your company. So that's a very weak point for him going forward. He's now the face of the opposition. He's the new fresh face, but he cannot lead. And really, I think the only way for him to pull off anything at all in the future is to become some sort of Macron, found his own party, bring a fresh organization that can then stand behind him, because right now he doesn't have a party worth mentioning.
Okay, Arpád, so your question was about whether people voted for a personality or a party. I think on the On the opposition side, they've definitely voted for a personality. Parties are very, very weak on the opposition side. Some of them are about to disappear. A lot of those brands are really, really sort of going out of existence, and they are associated with really negative associations. So there's hardly a party on the opposition side which has, probably Momentum is the only one which has some kind of upward sort of dynamics, but every other party pretty much stagnates or is going down. So they definitely voted for the personality. On the Fidesz side, they definitely voted for the party. And the case in point is Győr. I'm not so surprised that they ran Borkai in spite of the scandal. What I'm very surprised is that they basically hardly lost any votes in Győr. I mean, look, this is a guy, as you pointed out, who is campaigning on a Christian platform with his photographs of his family, the word family appearing on his Facebook site. So a Christian, family-oriented politician. And then he goes to a yacht on the Adriatic with prostitutes and cocaine on a religious holiday. Now, if this was happening if those voters really are Christian conservative voters, they should have been outraged. They should have basically, sent this guy running out of Győr with broomsticks or something. That's how you imagine, if these really were. But Fidesz, I checked the figures for Fidesz 5 years ago and now. I don't remember the exact figures, but the magnitude is correct. Fidesz got something like 43,000 votes 5 years ago. Now they got 40,000. So at a magnitude of about 40,000 voters, they lost 3,000 voters. Which basically says to me, it hardly had an effect. I'm not saying that people were not outraged. I'm pretty sure that those Fidesz voters who are genuinely Christian, conservative, family-oriented people obviously were outraged. But they're not looking at Borkai. Borkai is a pawn. Borkai wasn't a player. They're looking at Orbán. It's the movement that matters. It's the party that matters. Borkais can come and go. Borkais can be replaced. Nobody really matters in Fidesz. The only person who really matters in Fidesz is Viktor Orbán. Everybody else can be replaced. Therefore, it doesn't matter whether there's a Borkai running or not, because he can be replaced. And he has been replaced since then, so they were actually right. Fidesz voters were very right in calculating that it's not the person that matters, it's the movement that matters. And they voted definitely for the movement. Now, this issue of Karácsony, whether he can lead or not, look, he ran a political grouping. I mean, I'm glad we at least agree that his politics is genuinely, his ideas are genuinely left-wing, green ideas. He tried to formulate an alternative to the old systemic parties. He tried to create a party, he tried to offer an alternative to Hungarian voters, to the era of Gyurcsány. Where he stands today is that he has a small political platform and the opposition is fragmented, and a lot of voters, in spite of what he has been saying, still vote for 5, 6, 7% vote for Gyurcsány, 5, 6, 7% vote for MSP, the socialists. He has no other choice. He has to run together with these guys if he wants to win. Once he wins, he has no choice but to actually give these people some concessions. And I completely agree with you. These people are incredibly risky. People who came back from the previous era, and I think it's an over-exaggeration to say that the previous period basically overran the mayor's office. I mean, you can point out 5 or 6 figures who are problematic, some of them highly problematic. But you have hundreds of people in these commissions that we are talking about. So amongst a couple of hundred people who have now become, members of boards of public utilities and certain, commissions and of the mayor of the city government, basically you have 5, 6, 10 people who are, key players from the previous era. I completely agree with you. These guys are highly problematic and highly risky. It's a question of time. Time will tell whether Karácsony will be able to run a clean government and prove that he is better and strengthen his political position by being clean and efficient, or whether he will be forced to succumb to these forces from the past. I cannot say at the moment. I think only time will tell. I agree with you, it's incredibly risky, but I would not say at this moment that the mayor's office has been overrun to such a degree by the past that he has zero chance of governing or leading. It's a huge question mark. We'll see.
Thank you for your remarks. In general, there was most people could feel a sort of euphoria after the election, as especially in the supporters of the opposition, since most people felt that we can bring new places into the politics, as Balázs said as well, that politics is back in Hungary. Also myself, I was enthusiastic about how could a new political life work in Hungary. Yet some of the last week's news shocked me personally, I think, and also the Hungarian society. For instance, I put the picture in the back. Draškovič Tibor, who was a former Minister of Justice and Minister of Finance, who actually also greatly responsible for the fall of the Hungarian economy and the almost bankruptcy of the country economy, was appointed as a chairman of the board of BKK, which is the Budapest Public Transportation Company. But the list goes on. We could talk about Ceglidi Csaba, who was convicted for tax evasion, yet he was commissioned to screen the companies of 2 districts, surprisingly led by a DK mayor. And then we also have Havas Zsófia, who called the heroic 1956 revolution a Nazi movement, and he called the revolution a counter-revolution. So and the list goes on, we could talk about it for a while, but for me it's shocking as an outsider to see people who are failed, and especially like Draškovič Tibor, who failed big time in front of people as a minister, and then we appoint them. And if someone could explain me, I would be very grateful, because I cannot explain to myself.
But Arpád, I just explained to you. You have these people. I completely agree with you. These people are highly risky and highly problematic. There's no way they should be where they are. I agree with you. But look, these people were delegated by those political forces from the past without whom you cannot win today. What can you do? 5, 6, 7% of people still vote for Ferenc Gyurcsány and his party today. And Ferenc Gyurcsány delegates these people. What is it? They tried to fight it. Momentum tried to fight Ceglidi. And I'm not even sure that this is an issue that has already ended. Momentum actively protested against Ceglidi getting these contracts. I don't think this has been decided. This is an ongoing debate. As for Draškovič and Havas Zsófia and all the others, yes, they should not be there. But what do you do? If you say these coalition partners don't get their own positions, then they basically leave your coalition and you don't have a majority anymore. Unfortunately, you still have 5, 6, 7% of people voting for these parties.
It's really interesting to see the media echo about these things, and there's a boulevard paper in Hungary. It's called Blick. I tend to look at it somewhat more closely professionally, and it's interesting. They don't have an editorial line. They're regarded as critical by the government, I think. They have been exceedingly critical about these personnel decisions of Karácsony, and they are the biggest boulevard paper in the country. So it's interesting to see a paper that is not close to the government taking a very critical stance in these matters. I think Karácsony, in his very first steps, is running into
what would you do,
rough
Boris? If you were Karácsony, what would you do?
Well, you can't. But I don't think it's an auspicious. No, not resign. I mean, he has to go on and try to. But I think it's a very inauspicious start for him.
I don't want to be the one who defends Karácsony, for sure. But my problem is my problem is with the "what would you do" narrative. It's to my ears, it's pretty much the same narrative what we had between 2006 and 2010. Because back at the time, those people were in power, and everybody knew, especially after the Assad speech, which we were mentioning previously, that this government has no future. This government has no present as well. They don't have any strategic goal. They just want to survive. They don't want to do anything in connection with the country. They just want to survive politically. And I can remember back at that time, all the politicians and commentators and the experts on the leftist and liberal side were keep asking, what should we do? Because those are the ones who are on the left side. Those are the ones who were elected by the voters. Those are the ones who can go against the anti-Semitic, extremist, right-wing movements. We have to support them because otherwise the economy will collapse, because otherwise the Nazis will come back, and otherwise all the elements of these narratives are there. And what happened after more than 10 years, the same arguments are here. So, okay, we probably understand that we have lack of leadership. We don't have capability of managing our towns properly. We have huge tensions inside the coalition. We don't have any strategic goals. Our ideology is I try to be polite, is a mixture of ideologies. But what else can we do? Because if we don't have the power, then the right side will come back. Which means that Tarlós István and Fidesz would come back, which means that they have leadership, they have strategy, they have the capability of managing the country, which was very well proved in the last 9 years. So I understand why there is a narrative, and I understand that most probably there are people on that side and inside the municipal as well who have good intentions, but they are the minority. And the what else can we do narrative will cause serious demolition for the towns actually, because we're not just talking about.
Look, Balázs, let's suppose Fidesz was a very unproblematic party that had zero corrupt people in Fidesz. Nobody would be corrupt in Fidesz. There would be nobody in Fidesz saying problematic things that are out of the boundaries of anything, acceptable. Let's suppose this was the case. You still have a tradition of also forming coalitions. I mean, when Viktor Orbán first became prime minister, he had to form a coalition with this guy called József Tordján. Now, in retrospect, nobody in their sane mind would form a coalition with this person. Peace be upon him, he's dead, I think. But he was a very problematic person with a very problematic politics, and yet Viktor Orbán was forced to have a coalition with him. When József Antal became conservative prime minister of Hungary, he was forced to form once again a coalition with Tordján, but also with even more problematic guys in his own party. This is politics. Sometimes you have to make compromises with forces who are...
But the difference is that they were able to manage this hard situation.
And what I'm saying is we don't know yet. I mean, you cannot say that, we cannot say that Karácsony does not have a clear agenda. He does. You know exactly what his agenda is. I repeat again, it's a left-wing green agenda. Whether he will be able to govern that way is a question for the future. Whether these forces from the past will force him to govern the way they had governed before 2010, I agree with you. That would be a catastrophe. If that is the case, then the opposition is doomed in Hungary for 30 years, and Fidesz will govern until 2050 or 2060 or something. There will definitely not be a change of government if this is the case. If he manages to be stronger than these people and gain some political support by governing well, together with the mayors, then the opposite can happen. This is an open question for the future. It's not decided yet.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting phenomenon. So if I may, I would stay here for another question. It is obvious for us that they are failed figures. It is obvious for the audience, probably it's obvious for the Hungarian society and those parties themselves. So being a rational decision maker, you have two options from, let's say, from DK or MSP. The one option is that these people who are mentioned or whoever, they have such power what they pose, that they actually get appointed. And I hope that's not the case, and I think it's not the case.
Arpád, if you talk to an average DK voter, they are absolutely convinced that Ceglédi Csaba is an innocent person who has not done anything bad in his life ever. They are completely convinced that these people are okay. They don't know that these people are problematic.
And that's the second solution, which is even worse, I think, in my understanding. Today I had the chance to talk with Tordai Bence, who is a colorful figure, if you may say, in the Hungarian politics. I had a little discussion with him, and I mentioned this topic, and he said that, I'm not sure if I may quote him, but I will anyway. He said that if they would ask me, or us personally, the Párbeszéd, we would suggest people. We would suggest people for each position, but simply, they didn't even ask us. He said himself, they didn't ask us. They just appointed the people, and as you said, Zoltán, they had not much of a choice. They don't want, because they have to keep up the coalition. And this, again, leads to Karácsony himself, because he is the main figure, right? Everyone is behind him. So he has to be responsible, even if it's not in his hands, he should be responsible for these people. And it also, just one more quick remark, he said himself that he dislikes socialists more than he dislikes Fidesz. So at the end, it's his responsibility. So what just this last week's happenings project in the next years?
I think I've answered that question 3 times already.
It's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But I think we have outlined the major fault lines and the major points to keep in mind looking ahead. We have a leadership problem, we have a fragile coalition, they need to stay together until the next parliamentary elections, but they will try to stab each other in the back. They will try to steal money from taxpayers, and scandals will emerge in Budapest, and that will be mediatized, so I think they will have difficult times. The one thing that works against Fidesz maybe is that they're getting older, and young people. Yeah, they're getting older, and young people who.
My family name is Orbán,
yes.
also, and
okay,
I'm 33 years old. So, what do you want more?
What I mean is that by the time of the next elections, or elections after that, young people will not have known a time without Fidesz in government. And I meet people who I think are not receptive to any kind of arguments in favor of Fidesz, who say wrong. They think, for instance, they don't know about the Roma integration policy. Fidesz introduced it as a coherent concept, but they simply will not vote for Fidesz because it's an emotional thing. You cannot be seen with your own friends, that you cannot be seen as someone who will vote for Fidesz. So that's the one thing I think Fidesz have going against them.
Sorry for making a joke. I totally got your point, because I have the same feeling. I also have some opportunity to teach among some university circles and some colleges, and I have exactly the same feeling. So those who are 20 years old, they've grown up in a period of time when the prime minister, when the name of the prime minister was Viktor Orbán, no one else. The time when I was 20 years old, it was the time when the name of the prime minister was Ferenc Gyurcsány, and was totally upset what he is doing, and I had some hard feelings inside me that we should rebel against him, because it's unacceptable that's how our prime minister and our political elite operates, and they are not strongly emotionally involved, those who are currently around their 20s, but simply they just think that, okay, since I got my memories, at least from a political perspective. We have Fidesz government and we have Viktor Orban. So we just want to see something else, and that's a problem. And it takes time to explain, because it's an intellectual work to explain them that stability from a Hungarian historical perspective, it's crucial and it's very important. And if we try to understand how the Hungarian parliamentary system works, you can go back in the beginning of 20th century or end of 19th century, where you had a strong governing party with a strong figure. Let me just mention you one example, Kálmán Tisza, who was prime minister for 15 years. His name was General, and all the backbenchers behind him, he had a strong party behind him, they were called as dumb people who don't have any opinion, or they're not independent in a sense. And there were people on the other side, in the opposition camp, and they were called mixture of people. Radical right-wingers, radical left-wingers, everybody. It was a mixture of group of people. And back at that time, they were not able to regain control. That was a period when we had a Tisza Kálmán for 15 years, and after the same political system for like more than 20 years, and it was the brightest time of modern Hungary. So, for example, that's one argument. Yes, I think the dualism and the dualism and the beginning of 20th century, that was the brightest period of time in Hungarian history. So it's not easy to explain for young people that we have, if you want to understand the future, the only thing you have to do is you understand your past and who we are, where we're coming from, how we Hungarians think, who we are in this European context, and so on and so on. And then you will find the answer. I understand that we will not have the chance to convince everybody, but what I see is that the situation among the young intellectuals is not so bad as you mentioned. So still, Fidesz is the relative most popular party, and I hope that more and more people will be convinced that it's the best choice for them to stay on the conservative right-wing side.
When I tell my children 20, 30 years old that they just don't understand and they must make an intellectual effort, and what happened in the 19th century exactly explains my thoughts, then that tends to increase my difficulties. And I think there's only one way to speak to young people. It's to have young people in your party, visible in front, whom they can identify with emotionally. They want to be that person.
Then I am not the good person, because I like history. So I like to talk about history and not about the future.
I think we can both agree on your points, which are both very important. There are a number of topics that I wanted to talk about, but I think I just have to pick two of them, which I find the most important. One of them is that since we changed the mayor of Budapest, there are a number of big projects that were ongoing, and now their future is uncertain. Perhaps the two most prominent is the Liget project, which I think it's much more complex than the other one, and perhaps more argumentative. And the second big project is the 2013-23. The Athletic World Championship in 2023. So we won, obviously, most of you know the Bengal, we won the competition, and we will host the Athletic World Championship. You can see some pictures which I brought. On the right, you can see as it looks now, the place itself, it's basically loaded with trash, and it's unusable. It was abandoned like for years now. And by the way, this was also a decisive part of the project, because that's why it was chosen. Karácsony said himself that he's not supportive. He's not supportive at the moment of the hosting of the event, but he haven't give his final decision. What's your view on the project itself and whether we could make it or Karácsony will stop it?
According to my view, both projects would be very important and would serve in the interest of the people who live in Budapest. The Liget project is the biggest and the most prestigious cultural project of the century. It has nothing to do against the trees or the green ideas. The percentage of green fields in the Liget, they are rising and they will rise during the project, and the museum buildings and the new functions would be really important. What the government declared from the very first moment is that although we are on this opinion, we don't want to convince anybody, or we don't want to use our legal tools to force Budapest to support these projects. It's up to them what will happen. I think it would be a big loss for the voters if we cancel partially these projects. And it's pretty much the same with the athletics stadium, because it's not only about the World Championship, and it's not only about the big stadium. What we don't have in Hungary and in Budapest currently, and I think from a strategic perspective it makes sense to bring as much cultural and sport activity and championship as it is possible, because it can boost tourism, it can boost the interest, the knowledge of the Hungarian capital and Hungary itself. But the most important part of it is what you mentioned, is that it would be a brownfield development. So it's a part of Budapest which is in a very bad shape, and we want to change it, and not just through a stadium building infrastructure project, but also college building, side leg areas, and planning to have new parks and new infrastructure for the local people. We don't know what decisions they will make. It's really up to them. So if they say that we should stop, then we will cancel the World Championship, and we will cancel the whole project. We're waiting for the decision. They have time until the end of this month to have an official statement, and not only from the Karácsony side, but from the council side. So we need to have a supportive or a negative decision on the council side, because they will have the responsibility to act for the project or against it. So it's not only a decision, as I understand it clearly, from the Karácsony team.
Well, although Karácsony is, of course, a principled left-wing green politician, what he has actually said on the record is, well, how much money are you giving us if we allow your projects to proceed? He said, give us money for hospitals in Budapest, and then, for instance, the stadium in Csepel, the athletic stadium, may proceed. I think he needs to stop an element or two, because he has waged his electoral campaign with the promise of stadium stop. But I think he has shown some degree of pragmatism, and also some elements of his coalition partners have showed some degrees of pragmatism. Money will play a role, and I think the World Championship will go ahead, but who knows?
Look, there's a very good book by two authors called Acemoglu and Robinson, Turkish-American economist and an American economist, called Why Nations Fail, widely read book. Basically, the argument there is the nations that have grown strong and influential are the ones that have spread resources across society. So the wider you spread resources, the more human capital you create, the better your country fares economically and the stronger it becomes. And the nations that have failed are the ones who attract capital to, or resources to a small elite of people and create prestigious projects, showcase projects, and they spend the money on those things and not spreading out the resources evenly. They have a lot of empirical stuff to back this up. Now, what Hungary has been doing in the last 9 years is the second. Basically, if you look at the spending of the Hungarian state on education, we've constantly been spending way below the EU average on education, whereas our educational needs are actually much greater than the EU average. Hungarians speak the least languages in the EU, and the level of education in this country is worse, much worse than the EU average. So we would need to spend more than the EU average as a proportion of GDP, but we're spending less. The spending on health has been significantly lower, 3.5 percentage points below EU average, whereas the health status of Hungarians is not even comparable to the Visegrad states. It's actually comparable to the much poorer Balkans countries. So some of the worst figures for the health status of Hungarians have constantly been underspending on healthcare. And even the Court of Auditors, which is not unfriendly with the government, has said that the health sector is in shambles in Hungary. Basically, if you look at social policy, we've been spending 5-6 percentage points less on social policy than the EU average. If you look at public transport, if you look at retraining, all these subsectors of the state which spread resources have been underfunded. So I think it's fair to say that in any given year, there's a deficit of at least 10-12%, very conservative estimates, 10-12% of GDP as an investment into the human capital of this country. And you can see this in the output figures as well. You can see it in the PISA tests, you can see it in the health status, you can see it in all sorts of figures related to the rural areas of this country. Now, you cannot spend the same money twice. If you spend 90 billion forints on a football stadium, you cannot spend the same money again on education. If you keep on building football stadiums, museums, prestige projects, you cannot at the same time fund human resources accumulation in this country. And I think when you say the political ideas of Karácsony and Gergely are not clear, I think they're very clear. He does come from a left-wing perspective, and the left-wing perspective says human resources come first. Enabling people's mobility in the countryside comes first. Education comes first, healthcare comes first. Prestige projects come second. We are not going to fool the world into believing that Hungary is a successful country by building huge prestige projects, if otherwise the figures in healthcare, in education, etc., are not improving. If we're falling behind, we're not going to fool. The global media is good enough for people all over the world to understand this. I've been traveling in recent years from the US to China. Everyone understands that what matters is things like human capital. And just by building many countries, I mean, the example here is Greece. Greece organized the Olympics, and then Greece collapsed. Greece did not fool the world into believing that it's a strong economy by organizing the Olympics. It was very costly. It was much costlier than it was estimated to be at the beginning, as was the football stadium in Budapest. And Greece did not fool anybody in the world to believe that the economy of Greece is a strong economy. We won't fool anyone either. We really need to invest first into healthcare, education, retraining, public services. And here there's a generational divide in the opposition, because Momentum campaigned on this issue. They said we should spend all the money on healthcare and education. Karácsony believes the same thing. Now there might be people in the older parties from the former period who would support spending the money on prestige projects, because that's what they try to do as well. Don't forget, Gyurcsány wanted to build some kind of a government district, which was a complete nightmare. Would have drawn enormous traffic to one part of the city. Fortunately, he was so bad at governing that he never got around to building it. So there might be some nostalgia in the older parties for these kinds of issues, but in the younger generations of the opposition, definitely the preference is for human capital as opposed to prestige projects. Oh, and one more thing. Tourism and whether this will return anything to the Hungarian economy, let's not kid ourselves, it won't. We organized the swimming championships, and the swimming championships was a huge deficit for Hungary. We've been organizing the Hungaroring Formula One race for a long time. It's a deficit for Hungary. These things do not return, even holistically speaking, they do not return the investment into them. So the argument that this pays off, it does not pay off.
Just some comments. I also like the book from Acemoglu and Robinson, although I don't like their brand new book, which was published a couple of weeks ago. Everybody should read it as well. It's currently not available in Hungarian, but it's available in English. I would recommend you the first one, Why Nation Failed. But the key point in that book is, actually the first picture of that book is that they raised the question, the authors raised the question, how can it be possible that if you go down to the southern borders of the United States of America and you visit a border town on the side of the United States, and then you cross the borders and you visit a border town on the Mexican side, you will see huge differences, although the distance between the two border towns is only around 20 or 30 miles. How can it be possible that the living standard in one town is much higher than the living standard is in another town, that the rate of crimes it's much lower in the American city than in the Mexican city? So how can it be possible? And their answer is that it's because of the political system. The differences between the political systems are the driving forces, and that's how you can differentiate between successful countries and not successful countries. So if we want to follow the recommendations of Acemoglu and Robinson, our goal, so the goal of the Hungarians, is to invent our own political, economic, cultural system, which brings us prosperity, stability, and freedom. But it will be obviously a different system what we have in the United States, what we have in the UK, what we have in Sweden, what we have in Japan, what we have in Dubai and in other countries. We have to invent our own system, and that will bring us prosperity. And if you talk about, because that was your main argument, the distance between the richest part and the poorest part of the society, I agree with you that it is a problem. It would be a problem if the distance between the richest part and the poorest part of the Hungarians so the distance will be growing and growing. But the fact is, it's currently the opposite. I just wrote down some some figures. The level of poverty dropped since 2010 from 28% to 15%. And this is not a Hungarian data, it's the data of the European Statistic Office. We have 800,000 new people on the labor market. They were never, since the transition period, on the labor market. The unemployment rate among the gypsy communities, to mention the Roma development strategy, dropped with 50%. We had, since 2010, a utility cost cut with 25%. And the net salaries for everybody raised by 53% since 2010. So these figures and these facts are saying that we understood the lesson which is coming from the Acemoglu-Robinson book. So we try to shorten the distance between the richest part and the poorest part of the society. So this work is going on, but we need to have infrastructural projects as well, not because these are prestigious projects, but because that's how a modern state is functioning. And you always mentioning the Olympic Games in Greece, but you keep forgetting mentioning, for example, the Barcelona Olympic Games, which was the biggest victory for Spain and the biggest victory for the citizens of and the inhabitants of Barcelona. Previously, Barcelona was a small town, no access of global tourism, no economic power, a high rate of unemployment, and then the Olympic Games arrived in that town, and since then we all know what Barcelona means for everybody. Probably there is an overpopulation, probably there is an over-tourism. I know the leftist narrative that refugees welcome, tourists go home. There is a narrative like this, and it's coming from Spain. I think it's a bit paradoxical, but it exists that somebody can support immigration and not supporting tourism, but it makes not sense from our perspective. So you can reach both goals. You just have to have a political system which fits for the country you try to manage.
Well, obviously, the message of the book is not simply to invent your own political system, since if this was the case, then, you know, Hugo Chavez invented a very creative political system in Venezuela, and it doesn't seem to be functioning all that much, right? So, and Nigeria invented a political system, and so on. So there are many creative solutions at political systems, but not all of them are equally successful. The point is you have to invest one where you spread resources across society. Now, what is happening in Hungary? There are some good points here. I think you have to give credit where credit is due. The Fidesz government did raise the minimum wage, which is really important, and that's actually quite a paradox of Hungary, that the so-called former left-wing governments were against increasing the minimum wage. They were listening to liberal economists, and they never did that, which is a shame. That should not be the case. But Fidesz did raise the minimum wage, and that did decrease the poverty of people in work quite considerably. So I completely give credit where credit is due. But Hungary today is still the least socially mobile country in the European Union. You have Eurofound data backing that up. Hungary is the one country in the European Union with the least chances of social mobility. Why is that? That's to a large degree because of the non-functioning social compensatory mechanisms. For instance, if you look at the PISA tests, not only is it the problem that the average of the PISA results is falling in Hungary, but the biggest problem is that Hungary is the one country in the OECD where the educational system compensates territorial differences the least, worse than Brazil. So the selectivity of the educational system is so bad that it compensates geographical inequalities less than in Brazil or in any other OECD country. There is a 10 years difference in expected life expectancy between the 2nd district and the 8th district. In the same city, if you're born in the 2nd district, your life expectancy is 10 years longer than in the 8th district. You mentioned the employment rate. Yeah, well, we have a shortage of labor in Hungary. But why do we have a shortage of labor? 350,000 Hungarians went to Western Europe to work. 350,000. I don't quote the 500,000 figure because I think that's wrong. I'm not in a political race. I think we should stick to the figures, but 350,000 is a correct number. These are people who have gone to work in Western Europe. Secondly, the Hungarian government has been running a public works program which has involved something like 200 to 220,000 people. Most of these people are not going to the primary labor force, they're going back to unemployment. So it's an unsustainable, unproductive system. Number 3, European Union resources. According to a study which was basically published on the website of the Prime Minister's office, about 173,000 jobs are associated with European Union projects in Hungary. So if these projects disappeared, 173,000 jobs would also disappear. If you add that up, 350,000 gone to the West, 200,000 in unsustainable public works programs, 173,000 working in EU-related projects, you've explained most of the growth of the employment in Hungary. I don't think that that's such a huge success. Finally, Olympics. If you take the time and read about the financial sustainability of Olympics across the world, in the last 40 years there has been one single Olympics which actually did not make a deficit. One. Every other Olympics ended up, holistically speaking, including all the revenues from tourism, every other one made a deficit rather than a surplus. There was only one. I'm not sure if it was Barcelona or Salt Lake City. I remember at Salt Lake City, it might have been Barcelona. It's a long time ago that I read it, but go and read it. You will find that there was only one which did not make a loss.
I must say I agree with both of you when it comes to the stadium and where should we spend our money. I think the biggest problem with stadium is the ones that are not sustainable economically. And those are the ones, the small ones, like at Balmazújváros, Mezőkövesd, MTK, those are the ones that are the problem. But not the national stadium, for instance, which can turn many profit. Not this one, for instance, the athletic stadium, which will create a lot of green space, and there are many estimates that, let's say, it would bring a 60 billion effect just in the economy. And then we could also talk about the Olympic stadiums, or the one that is going to be built in 2022 for the handball European Cup. I know that you are an expert in Greek, so I don't mean to go into so much details, but Greek was also, they had very bad macro and microeconomic figures prior to the crisis, and this was stopped by the Olympic Games. But I think it's very difficult to measure all the effects that the Olympics brings.
That was exactly my point, that they had very bad macroeconomic figures and they tried to fool the world into believing that the Greek economy is strong because they organized the Olympics. They made it worse. Actually, the Olympics added 9% of GDP to their debt to GDP because it made a huge loss. That's exactly my point.
To summarize up quickly, I think we should support the ones that are economically sustainable, and we should definitely stop the ones that are not sustainable. So I think we could organize another discussion just on the Olympics and other events like that. But I think for now it would be more appropriate if we give the floor to Mark Higgy, who would correspond the event in general.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Arpád, and I think I'm speaking for everyone in the room in saying what a terrific, lively discussion that was. I think particularly the Zoltán Balázs show. I think you could sell tickets for that next time. The only negative comment I'd make is that Michael O'Sullivan and various other people in the room who live in the 8th district were rather depressed by your comment that we have lower life expectancy than others, perhaps. On the question of opinion polls, of course, the result for Budapest followed what you might call the rich recent tradition of failed opinion polls, election of Trump, the Brexit referendum, and in my own country, Australia, the thumping return of the Conservatives earlier this year. So Hungarians shouldn't feel too bad that they're unique in somehow having misleading opinion polls. On the question of the reason for the, I suppose you'd have to say that in terms of the way the international media reacted to the results, less prominent was the fact that Fidesz was the overall winner than the fact that there was a big reversal for Fidesz in Budapest. And that result was very interesting. Balázs, you mentioned 2006 as an interesting sort of previous result. Of course, that, as you mentioned, followed the leaked Gyurcsány comments, which caused a political earthquake. With these elections, of course, they did follow, as you talked about, Zoltán, the Győr story. My reaction was that if Mr. Torlos was the one who'd been on the yacht on the Adriatic with the prostitutes of the coast, this would have caused a lot of surprise, I suppose. But nevertheless, you would expect such a huge political reaction if it had been Mr. Torlos, not the mayor of Győr. So I'm still a little bit intrigued as to why we had this result, given the recent solid wins by Fidesz nationally and at the European elections earlier this year. But I suppose if I could finish with one particular question, and that is how the new administration of Budapest will be different to what we've had previously. And to the extent that my limited Hungarian allows, I was trying to follow the actual policy commitments of the people in charge and the opposition. And I must say, it was a bit hard to identify exactly in concrete detail how the opposition would differ in what they would do. Now, we had a little bit of discussion before on the athletics stadium and the Liget and so forth, and I know from walking in the 5th district that one of the candidates said that the Belváros would not be a bully Nedjed. That's one specific policy, and that's good. We've heard a few little, but I suppose the particular question I'd ask is, now you've said that the new mayor has a left-green agenda. You hear little stories such as the fact that he might want to make the chain bridge pedestrianised, for example. But is it possible just to say a little bit more about exactly how his and his allies' vision, in concrete terms, for this city differs? There have been suggestions for a much more radicalised pedestrian centre for the city, for example. Does the green agenda affect other things? Public transport, access by cars, etc., etc. So I might just leave my comments at that, and I'd be very interested in anything you in particular perhaps might be able to say about that. But thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a very good question, obviously. This is the key question, what they are promising and what they will be fulfilling of these promises. Just a short list. Green left, the green part. There will be a congestion fee. So they have already announced that there will be a congestion fee. Actually, the congestion fee seems to be quite universally accepted. István Tarlós himself mentioned in the campaign that he would also introduce a congestion fee, so I expect Fidesz to vote for it after that. Basically, so that's definitely a game changer for this city, where if you live here, you find that on most work days in the morning and in the afternoon, it's terrible. So there's definitely a need for a congestion fee. Second thing is he's already declared a climate emergency in Budapest. Climate emergency boils down to practicalities at the level of public procurement. So the sustainability aspects of public procurement will receive higher points in public procurement than before. That's the essence for the moment of the climate emergency thing. Obviously, the preservation of green areas, etc. So the green agenda is relatively obvious. What is the social agenda? Fixing the issue of housing is number one. This is a city where you have a housing problem both at the level of homelessness, so you have a relatively large number of people sleeping in the streets, which local mayors have not been able to solve for 30 years, so that needs to be solved quite rapidly. The second level is at the level of social housing. So districts have not lent out their social housing to poor people. They have avoided bringing in poor people to their districts because that would have downgraded the district in the eyes of the people living there. Instead, they have often rented the available social housing to political cronies, effectively. So what these districts are now doing is that they're basically reviewing the contracts with the political cronies, and they promise to lend these flats to actual people in need. Also, many districts have promised to build new social housing, so there's a need for new social housing. There's a debate on a cap on rent. Some people believe that a cap on rent is needed to control the exorbitant rents that have come about in this city. I mean, especially university students are unable to pay for the gigantic rents which have emerged in recent years. Other people believe that a cap on rent is not the right solution. It decreases supply, so this is an ongoing debate, but definitely there would need to be social housing built. Districts have more money, so the other issue is the redesigning of the relationship between the districts and the mayor of Budapest, because the mayor of Budapest has a lot of competencies. For instance, in the issue of homelessness, they have most of the competencies, but they don't have the budget. The districts have the money, but they don't have the competencies. So they have to work together to solve these issues, because otherwise what happens is what has been happening in recent decades, that districts tend to kick homeless people from one district to the other. Nobody wants them. They don't have the resources. They don't have the institutions. The city, or Budapest has the institutions and districts have the money. But so far, it's these homeless people have been a political football between the different districts. So they have to work together to find a solution to that. Those are the ones. Raising the wages of public sector employees. So these people are extremely underpaid, especially the people working in social care and homeless care. Encouraging unionization, so encouraging public sector workers who work for the city to become members of trade unions, and basically not instituting the so-called slave law, which the government introduced last year about overtime and the payment of overtime. So the city has pledged not to deploy the slave law at any of the. So these are the issues, basically.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your remarks, and Zoltán for the response. And I would like to thank General for all of you to make space in your tight schedule and accepting our invitation. Also, special thanks for the Danube Institute who allowed us to organize the event. And perhaps we come back for another event with the Olympics, or how should we spend our GDP. That may also be an interesting discussion. So thank you very much again for coming, and wish you a pleasant time.